The locals always whispered about Hollow Brook Cabin. They said it was cursed, that anyone who stayed there too long would hear voices in the walls, shadows creeping in the corners of their vision. But to Aaron and his friends, it was just another abandoned place, perfect for a weekend of fun. Aaron, Liz, Jake, Maya, and Tom arrived late in the evening. The sun was slipping beneath the horizon, casting eerie shapes through the skeletal trees. The cabin stood in the middle of the forest, old and forgotten, its wooden planks warped with time. "This place gives me the creeps," Maya muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Relax," Jake grinned. "It's just a cabin. Ghost stories don't scare me." As night fell, they built a fire and swapped scary stories, laughter echoing into the darkened woods. But soon, the laughter died as a faint sound carried through the air, a whisper so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. "Did you hear that?" Liz asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom shook his head. "Probably just the trees." But Aaron wasn't so sure. He felt something watching them, something unseen. When they finally retreated inside, exhaustion setting in, the whispers continued. Louder this time, hushed voices overlapping, filling the cabin like a swarm of unseen insects. Aaron shot up in his sleeping bag, heart hammering. "Guys, wake up!" Liz was already awake, eyes wide with terror. "I can hear them. They're in the walls." The others groggily stirred, but as soon as they listened, their faces drained of color. The whispers grew frantic, desperate. Then came the knocking, faint at first, then pounding. Bang! 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 The sound came from inside the cabin, yet there was no one there. Maya screamed as the door to the bedroom burst open on its own. A shadow slithered across the floor, stretching toward them. "We need to get out," Aaron hissed, grabbing his flashlight. The others scrambled to their feet, but as they reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. The windows, once clear, were now pitch black, as if swallowed by the darkness outside. Then the whispering stopped. Silence, thick and suffocating, filled the cabin. Then a voice, one clear and unmistakable, echoed in their ears. "You shouldn't have come." The shadows lunged. When Aaron opened his eyes, he wasn't in the cabin anymore. He was outside, lying on the damp forest floor. The sun was rising, casting an eerie orange glow through the trees. He gasped and scrambled to his feet, his body aching. "Maya? Liz? Jake? Tom?" he called, but there was no answer. The cabin stood behind him, silent, unchanged, as if the night had never happened. The car was still parked at the edge of the woods. He ran toward it, but the keys were gone. His friends were gone. Dizzy and disoriented, Aaron stumbled back toward town. When he arrived, breathless and wild-eyed, the townsfolk stared at him with a mixture of pity and fear. "You're the only one who ever came back," an old woman murmured. Aaron shook his head. "No, that's not possible. They were just with me." "They were taken," she said simply. "The cabin keeps what it wants." Desperate, Aaron gathered a search party, but when they reached the cabin, it was abandoned. No signs of struggle, no footprints, nothing, as if his friends had never existed at all. That night, unable to sleep, he heard the whispers again. They called his name, soft and pleading. He turned toward the window, and in the reflection he saw them, his friends staring back, trapped in the cabin's glassy void. Their mouths moved soundlessly, their eyes wide with terror. Then, in the darkness behind them, something moved. A figure loomed in the reflection, its shape shifting like smoke, its hollow eyes locked onto Aaron. A guttural whisper crawled into his ears. "You are next." The room turned cold. The lights flickered. The walls creaked as if breathing. The whispers turned to screams, filling every corner of his mind. Aaron clutched his head, his vision blurring, the reflection twisting into a vortex of darkness. When he blinked, he was standing in front of the cabin again. But this time, the door was open. and deep inside, his friends' voices called to him. "Come back. Aaron." The shadows swallowed the doorway, and he felt himself stepping forward, unable to resist. The wind whispered his name, and as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. The cabin had claimed another soul, and the whispers would never stop. It had been over a decade since Emily and her friends last set foot in Hollow Brook Cabin. A weekend getaway was supposed to be a fresh start, an attempt to face the lingering memories of their terrifying experience there years ago. The cold whispers that slithered through the walls, the shadows that seemed to move on their own, and the inexplicable chill in the air. Things they could never quite explain. Despite the fear that still gripped them, they hoped that returning would bring some closure. But from the moment they stepped inside, an uneasy feeling settled in their bones. The cabin, though it appeared untouched by time, seemed to exhale a heaviness, as though it had been waiting for them to return. The air was thick, the silence suffocating. As night fell, the house seemed to come alive with an unsettling energy. The shadows grew darker, longer, and began to stretch out in unnatural ways. The crackling of the fire did little to chase away the cold that suddenly enveloped the room. Emily and her friends sat in uneasy silence, trying to ignore the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them from the corners of the room. That's when they heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from upstairs. The group froze. "It's just the house settling," one of them murmured, but the words didn't sound convincing, even to them. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as though whatever was upstairs was coming for them. Suddenly, a gust of freezing wind burst through the cabin, extinguishing the fire, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence that followed, the footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being hunted didn't. Panic began to set in, and in that instant, one by one, Emily's friends vanished without a trace. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, just eerie silence. The only clues left behind were cryptic messages scrawled on the walls, hints of something sinister lurking just beyond their grasp. Alone, terrified, Emily searched the cabin, desperate for answers. Deep in the attic, she uncovered an old, weathered diary. Its pages were stained with something dark and ancient. As she read, a chilling voice seemed to echo in her mind. "The shadows here are not to be trusted. They will take what is theirs and never return it." Emily's heart pounded as she realized that the house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on the souls of those who dared enter. The spirits that plagued Hollow Brook were not mere phantoms. They were vengeful, trapped in a never-ending cycle, cursed to torment anyone who stepped into the cabin. And now, Emily was trapped too. She would never leave unless she uncovered the truth behind the cabin's tragic past. But the longer she stayed, the more the house seemed to close in around her, threatening to claim her as its next victim. Ben and Claire had no choice but to accept the inheritance of Hollow Brook Cabin from Claire's late aunt, who had always warned that the place was cursed. The stories she told of eerie voices, strange occurrences, and ghostly figures wandering the grounds had always sounded like mere superstition. But as they stood in front of the cabin, staring at the dilapidated structure surrounded by thick woods, an unsettling sensation washed over them. The air felt heavy, thick with something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The cabin seemed ancient, as though it had absorbed the memories of its past, memories that were desperate to be remembered. They decided to stay for the weekend, hoping to renovate the place and sell it quickly. But as night fell, Claire began to hear faint whispers, almost like the wind carrying words that weren't meant for her to hear. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than the house settling, but then she heard the crying. It was soft at first, like a child's sobs, drifting from the woods outside. drawn by the sound, Claire peered out the window, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the darkness of the forest, illuminated only by the pale moonlight, was a young girl, her hair matted with rain, her face twisted in sorrow. Her eyes were hollow, devoid of life, yet filled with a deep, unbearable grief. Claire recoiled, heart racing, but when she looked again, the girl was gone. Terrified, Claire turned to Ben, but he remained dismissive, chalking it up to her imagination. However, as the night wore on, he too began to feel the strange pull of the cabin's past. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. It was as if the cabin was breathing, exhaling its dark secrets into the very fabric of their being. Ben searched through old letters and photographs that Claire found in the attic, and what they uncovered was far more sinister than they had ever imagined. The family who once lived here had mysteriously vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of betrayal, deceit, and a terrible crime that had stained the land with blood. But the most chilling discovery was a letter hidden among the belongings of Claire's aunt, which read, "The spirit of the house will never forgive those who wronged it. It will wait, and it will claim all who trespass." It became clear that the spirits of the cabin's former inhabitants were still trapped, bound by a curse that refused to let them go. As Ben and Claire struggled to unravel the mystery, they found themselves stalked by a presence, something far older and far more malevolent than they could have imagined. The house seemed alive, its walls echoing with the voices of the past, the ground beneath them vibrating with an eerie energy. The spirits of the lost family were restless, and they would not rest until their story was told. The couple had no choice but to face the truth of what happened to the family that once called Hollow Brook Cabin home. But the more they uncovered, the more the cabin seemed to close in on them. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the spirits grew more restless, angrier, demanding retribution. They realized too late that they had become a part of the cabin's cursed history, and there was no way out. To survive, they had to confront the darkness that had been waiting for them all along. But would they be able to escape the horrors of Hollow Brook, or would they too become part of its tragic legacy?